Many people across the Western world are realizing that despite our technological advancement, we've lost our values somewhere along the line. These days we don't seem to know what a man is, we don't seem to know what a woman is, we don't even seem to know what a nation is beyond tawdry woke cliches about tolerance, inclusion and diversity. Now, it would seem that many have realised that scientific rationalism hasn't brought about the liberal utopia as promised, and we need to re-find our foundation. Yet there's one very big problem with all of that. How do we deal with the biggest issue of our age, that is, mass immigration? You'll find some voices on the right state, why on earth should we go back to our Christian roots? Christianity's too weak, it preaches universal love, and that's a precursor to mass immigration. And on the counter, you'll hear from the left, how can you be a Christian and be anti-immigration? Aren't you supposed to love your neighbour and support the poor? Now, I'll start with the criticism from the right first. Living from a standpoint of universal love does not equal open borders in any sense at all. In essence, it means to be without hate, which often corrupts and backfires, and it means to recognise the shared being in all men and be of goodwill where possible. The idea that Christian belief is historically consistent with mass migration and open borders is essentially a bastardization of the religion via liberalism. In essence, the criticism the right are offering isn't necessarily of Christianity, but of liberal Christianity, which prizes only one pole of the religion, which is compassion and empathy, and ignores the other pole of truth, justice and boundaries. You put these two things together and you get something amounting to wisdom. After all, if that was the true nature of Christianity, how would Europe have grown in the first place? Why would we have ever bothered with the Crusades? The answer, of course, is because that isn't Christianity. It's a soft, soppy facsimile of what it really is. And if the West is to truly find its roots, it's going to have to wake up to what it's really based on, rather than what liberals make out it's based on. And this leads me to the criticism that often comes from the left. They want to make Jesus out to be a desert-wandering hippie. However, while he was deeply compassionate and full of love, he wasn't a weak man. He was a very strong man who'd tell the truth when he had to. Now, I should start by saying that I'm not actually totally anti-immigration. If numbers are quite small and the people coming here are from a similar cultural background and they're willing to integrate, I don't have too much of a problem. It's when every person from every corner of the world, from every culture of the world comes here, I think the problems start. But with regards to the charge we often hear that aren't you supposed to love your neighbour, that is very true. You are supposed to love your neighbour. Again, however, that doesn't mean open your borders to the rest of the world and welcome every single refugee who wants to come here. Now, if you embrace a liberalist interpretation of Christianity, that doesn't make any sense. However, if you have the full understanding of Christianity, which inculcates wisdom too, it very much does. The obvious problem with mass immigration is that people from every culture and every corner of the earth are going to come here and fundamentally undermine Christianity and Christian culture. When it comes to asylum seekers, if you try and welcome everybody that wants to come here, all that does is create more and more coming for the free benefits, many of whom, if we're honest, probably aren't even asylum seekers, given they're throwing their passports overboard and abandoning their families in their home countries. It's a very strong argument to state that these young men coming here won't only cause dysfunction when they land in Europe, but will be better off being back home, supporting their families and building their own nations. Sometimes the most just thing you can do for somebody is leave them to put their own life back together. And it should be remembered as well that while there is a Christian impulse in our culture to help the lost and the needy, mass migration has come in the era of secular liberalism. Henceforth, when secular liberals engage in their globalist utopian plan, they then blackmail Christians with the words of Christ taken out of context to make them come on board to their own agenda. And of course, many Christian leaders these days are so weak and are terrified of being shouted at by the BBC and the Guardian, they just go on board with it to look like good, kind, loving people. This means our religious leaders are increasingly selling out their own people, their own nations, and their own religion, all in the name of liberalism. The true structure is something like this. God is the source of all, the Father of all people. Christ is the moral standard made into human form that we're supposed to follow. He stands at the root of civilizations, namely Western culture. That civilizational family then breaks down into nations. You could think Italy, France, Germany, Britain. Within each of these you have communities and regions, and within each of these you have townships, and then families, and then the individual. That's the great chain of being, starting with God and going right down to one's own moral and spiritual life. Incidentally, it's this great chain of being which also protects us from state tyranny. That's why communists have always banned Christianity. And a simple way to understand the argument against mass immigration from a Christian perspective is to think how each of those nodes would be impacted by letting someone from outside in. For instance, in your own family home, would you just let someone needy in? Maybe if you're being kind and making him a cup of tea, but on the whole, it's not the best idea unless you know you're going to be able to keep your own family safe. It's the same thing with the local community. Do you let somebody new in? Well, yes, if they adhere to the same moral value systems as you, seem to hark back to a shared dynamic, and on top of that aren't going to cause any trouble amongst the wider community. However, should you let people in who undermine the ethos of the local community? Of course you shouldn't. That creates chaos and danger, and it's an injustice to the people already there. Now, commonly here, a leftist may say something like, yes, but the British and the Europeans colonised the world, doing all sorts of evil everywhere. But personally, I don't buy that reading of history at all. Yes, Britain and Europe have got some sins we have to deal with, but ultimately we created the modern world. We won the game of empire and then ended slavery around the world via Christian principles. In terms of the civilizational advancement, the technology and the moral standard that we brought around the world, I think we've given more than we've taken on balance, and henceforth don't really need to hang our head in shame. Finally, I do also believe that every civilization harks back to some understanding of the divine. You could think about the Brahman in Hinduism, Allah in Islam, and so on and so on. Each of these belief systems feeds into the foundations of their civilization. That's their civilization, not mine. I wouldn't seek to undercut that. The same thing shouldn't happen to Europeans either, so I think we're on very firm ethical ground here. In essence, I'm not stating here that we should jettison compassion and kindness from our tradition. Instead, I'm saying we should add the other traditional counterpole of truth, justice, authority, and boundaries. It's only when we have the full picture that we can act in a sensible way that can guide us into the future. These are just my thoughts, however. Do let me know what you think down below, and do consider subscribing to the channel.